Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eileen Pitpitan. I am a professor in the School of Social Work in the College of Health and Human Services. I want to thank Mark and Ksenia so much for inviting me to speak with you all here today. I want to first start out by letting you all know or apologize in advance. I'm getting over a cold, and I'm just one of those people, it's been this way my whole life, that I have a cough that tends to linger for weeks. So please be patient with me if I need to pause. So it's a pleasure, as I said, to be with you all here today to talk about some of my research. The title of my talk is Maximizing Scientific Knowledge from Intervention Trial Data. A little bit of background about myself. I am trained as a social psychologist, and my research is on the development and evaluation of interventions designed to promote engagement in the HIV prevention and care continuum. And the communities that I work with include marginalized and key populations like people who use drugs, as well as racial, sexual, and gender minority populations. I began working in the area of HIV intervention research in 2011, so going on 15 years. And one thing that I can say that we've learned from this work is that behavior change is really hard to achieve, right? It's difficult and it takes a long time to develop these kinds of interventions that are designed to change behaviors related to HIV transmission and care, things like substance use, medication adherence, sexual activity, and injection drug use. Then once we get to the point when we can rigorously evaluate these interventions or the efficacy of these interventions, we turn to the gold standard research design, the randomized controlled trial, or the RCT. Now these are very large, expensive, time-consuming studies, and they're designed to test effects of interventions or treatments on a primary or secondary outcome. And one thing we've observed in our research is that in the field of HIV, perhaps not unlike other health behavior change research fields, once the primary outcomes are published, oftentimes the data go untouched. And what we've argued over the past several years is that we as scientists have an ethical imperative to really maximize use of these existing trial data, especially when we're trying to address inequities in HIV or healthcare, and we're working with hardly reached populations or vulnerable populations. We owe it to them to learn as much as we can from their data. So what more is there to learn from trial data? What you see here is a depiction of the kinds of models that we're testing in our research with existing trial data. First off, I want to say that when we think about traditional RCT outcome analysis on looking at effects on either the primary or secondary outcomes, we have to understand that ultimately what we are doing is only estimating the total effect of the intervention on the outcome, right? But this total effect is actually the sum of different paths of influence, including the direct effect of the intervention on the outcome, as well as the indirect effects or the product of the A and B paths, which represent the path from the intervention to some third, let's say, mediator variable, and then the path from the mediator variable to the outcome. And we have evidence in our lab, as well as in other studies, that it is possible to observe significant indirect effects through some mediating variable, even in the absence of a total effect of the intervention. It is also possible that even in the absence of a total effect, you might have some third variable changing or moderating the effect of the intervention on the outcome, right? So we're talking about non-significant trials here, but arguably, even in trials where interventions are ruled as efficacious, it's even more important to learn as much as we can from the data to dig deeper into identifying the mechanisms that drove effects, as well as the subgroups that might have benefited most or least from the intervention. And that is the kind of work that we're trying to do, all with the goal of ultimately designing briefer, cheaper, more impactful and targeted interventions in the future. So we've been funded to do this work since 2018. Back then, we successfully applied for an R01. Sorry about the formatting here. This is when I try to do like download some cool Canva template and it doesn't translate to PowerPoint, I guess. So we applied for an R01 under one of NIDA's standing RFAs for secondary analysis studies, designed to accelerate the pace of drug abuse research using existing data. And in our first R01, we focused on examining trials that were testing interventions for at-risk HIV-negative populations. And then in 2023, we were funded to continue this line of work to apply these sorts of questions and methods to look at interventions for people with HIV who use drugs in interventions testing HIV care engagement interventions. And we call these studies the EMI studies, short for Estimating Mediation and Moderation Effects. So we're analyzing data across the two studies from 8 completed trials. All of these trials were evaluating intervention that was theory-based, meaning that the behavior change intervention was informed by one or more health behavior change theories, and they were tested in different populations across the world, including, for example, people who inject drugs in Eastern Europe, and also young women and men in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a figure that sort of represents a summary of the kinds of mediation and moderation models that we're testing in EMI. And you can see in the legend are the 4 trials that we're examining in the current grant, EMI2. And what you see in these boxes are the variables that we're testing, for example, as hypothesized mediators or moderator variables. And the number denotes that it was measured in that specific trial. So we're looking at things like social support, network communication, and HIV treatment beliefs. HIV, like many other health behavior change interventions, HIV care interventions that are theory-based, these theories point to the elements that need to be targeted in order to drive effects on ultimately behavior change. These are the kinds of behavioral outcomes being tested, as well as distal biological outcomes like viral suppression and mortality. We're also looking at things like depression, incarceration, housing instability that might have changed that effect of the intervention on the outcome, or really, for example, by saying that the intervention's efficacy depended on some other third variable. And finally, we're looking at conditional process models or moderated mediation, where it might be that some of these mediated pathways depend on a moderator variable. I just want to highlight findings from 2 studies that we've completed. One is published and the other is currently in prep. The first is a study that we did with data from HPTN 015, Project Explore, which was the first large-scale RCT testing a behavioral intervention to promote condom use among about 4,300 sexual minority men in the United States. The intervention in this trial was ruled as non-efficacious, so there was no effect in the trial. But again, in an effort to dig deeper to understand other things that might be happening beyond looking at the total effect, we applied a moderated mediation analysis. And we found that the intervention was in fact efficacious among men with low stimulant use. So this is showing, for example, or in this model, that the intervention was significant in reducing condomless receptive anal sex with HIV positive or status unknown partners, which in turn we know increases the risk of HIV infection. But this mediated effect was only found for men with low stimulant use, suggesting then that we need to target this behavior, not just sexual behavior among men who have sex with men. Now, these findings are not necessarily new. It's something we know when we're working with these key populations at risk for HIV, that addressing methamphetamine use, for example, is key to promote behavior change and reduce risk for HIV. The goal here is to really understand that there was more to learn in this trial beyond just looking at the overall effect on the primary outcome. We also looked at data from HPTN 074. This was a trial that was tested among people with HIV who inject drugs in 3 countries. It was found to be efficacious in improving viral suppression, use of medications for opioid use disorder or mood use, and also survival. And what we wanted to do was hone in on stigma, which we know to be a robust barrier to treatment and care. So we tested stigma as a moderator, specifically HIV stigma here at the top, and a drug use stigma here at the bottom, a moderator of efficacy on mood use. And what we found was that among people on the left here who did not report stigma at baseline, you see the effect of the intervention as we saw in the overall outcome analysis. However, when you look among people who did report experiencing these types of stigma, the intervention effect is no longer there, demonstrating that the efficacy of the intervention is limited to people who did not report this type of stigma. Again, suggesting that we need more targeted interventions or a co-intervention addressing stigma and discrimination based on HIV or drug use, in addition to the intervention that was tested in this trial to really promote more equitable outcomes. So overall, we're trying to convey that we need to maximize scientific insights from existing trial data. And one of the ways to do that is to examine mediators and moderators of efficacy. And we also argue that really this should be a standard part of outcome evaluation, that apart from just defining primary and secondary outcomes, researchers should a priori outline the kinds of mechanisms that they believe should be targeted and that should explain behavior change and ultimately the primary and secondary outcomes, as well as provide hypotheses around the certain subgroups that might benefit most or least from the intervention. Ultimately, these kinds of analyses can inform the elements of the intervention that should be paired up or ramped down in future implementation efforts, tailored interventions for specific subgroups. And then lastly, I'll just mention another thing we're working on is disseminating practical tools for researchers interested in applying these types of analyses to their data. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little over time.
So this was great. We're doing something similar for the many measures we collected during the clinical trial that we recently finished up. And the problem that we have is we're not powered to do a lot of these risk moderation analyses. So I'm curious how we got the pooled data sets. Were those all clinical trials that your group did, or did you pull from other researchers? How did that work?
Yeah, thank you. That's Katrina, thank you. That was a really good question. So I want to clarify that these are not pooled data sets. So we're analyzing each of these trials separately. They're all testing different interventions in different populations, have different measures, as you saw in that figure, of the kinds of things that you could test as mediators and moderators. So it just was not possible to pool them. But the way that we identified, the possibilities of the data sets that we could look into, we did actually conduct a systematic review for the second R01 to look at, if we look at interventions designed to promote HIV care engagement among people who use drugs specifically, what RCTs have been conducted, what have they found, and have they looked at moderators or mediators? And overall, I think we found 12 trials and only 1 or 2 had done these additional analyses. So we started there, and then we, whenever we plan these, we contact the PIs to see if they're willing to share the data. And in terms of power, that is something we've struggled with, which is why I think that if researchers outline, for example, specific moderator variables, then maybe they could do stratified recruitment to ensure that there is enough power to detect these kinds of effects. But I think arguably there's already so many resources that go into a trial in the first place. But certainly that's an opportunity, I think, for supplemental funding to answer, I think, these kinds of important questions. Another thing I wanted to say is that you brought up the many measures that you all are looking at and that you actually included in your surveys. That has been a big challenge with the work that we're trying to do, is that even when investigators are designing interventions that are supposed to be theory-based, they don't go on to actually measure those theory-based variables that, could explain the behavior change. And I think, the goal really is to reduce survey burden among participants, but ultimately, we argue that that's really important information to include if you're really trying to, identify those kinds of elements or mechanisms that ultimately can drive effects that you can ramp up in future implementation. Yeah.
I guess these are, it's kind of a comment, maybe a question, but this is really interesting, and I think I have some insight in what you do because we work closely together
Yes.
on other things. But this makes me think I had several intervention studies that failed miserably, and I think things could be salvaged just from sort of taking a look at this stuff. But I guess the other thing that really underscores is the importance of data sharing and having data from clinical trials accessible to the research community to do these kinds of things that maybe, TIs or folks that were funded for the grant don't have time, or they're on to something different. But I think it's really important, and the burden on respondents or participants is really important. However, if you're doing a trial that doesn't work, if you have these additional questions that fit into theories or hypotheses, it is, I think, ethically justifiable, if not, making the argument that you should do this, so you're not wasting people's time.
Yes. I
Anyway.
certainly agree.
I
Yes.
guess there wasn't really a
Yeah.
question.
No, but
Sorry.
I think there has been a shift in, practice in terms of data sharing. Certainly, we've seen NIH roll out new policies where if you're federally funded, you need to share your data on public repositories, and I think that's important for the sake of integrity and transparency in our science.
Time for one more question, or?
Well, I just want to tell a comment to this. Thank you for this, because I think that at this point in science, we have amassed this huge mass of data, right? And not only sharing, but also a lot of it, especially in the intervention world, is kind of disappointing when it doesn't work out.
Yes.
So this is really a clever way of trying to not only figure out what applicability it might have in terms of, some parts or subparts of these interventions or aspects, but also how to think about it in terms of a theoretical framework.
Yes.
Right? So it could be really helpful in that regard. So
Yeah.
I think it's really wonderful.
Thank you, Ksenia. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone.